as Chris introduced, my current job is working advising companies, mostly American companies, but some foreign companies on situation in Asia. It can be very specific work, problem solving regarding a particular market problem, looking for partners, trying to find solutions to regulatory issues and the like, or it can be broader advisory work and identifying general market trends and political situations. Our firm is comprised of the senior people are all former government folk with a variety of experiences in different agencies and different countries of East Asia. And I want to say at the outset a shout out to the Heinrich Foundation, which is I'm working with, associated with, and that they've been sponsoring these kind of activities in the past. Last year's opportunity in Hong Kong to meet with a similar group, also organized by the National Press Foundation, was focused very much on the US-China situation. And this year now we're talking about a different problem set as it impacts both global trade, but also I think beyond trade to other aspects of the global economy. What you'll hear me say is a variety of information that points to three trends, which I think are happening in succession and perhaps even simultaneously, but which should all be identified as important ones in people's reporting and understanding of what's happening. The first is decoupling, that conversation around the increasing distance between the US economy and the Chinese economy in particular, driven largely by geostrategic considerations, changes in how those countries are viewing one another, and the policies that they see as most appropriate for their economic engagement, given the overall competitive atmosphere between the United States and China. And the United States and China, of course, is a proxy for a lot of other tense relationships in the world. Not US-China one isn't the only one, but it was the principal driver, and I think will continue to be the principal driver of that theme of decoupling, meaning what should happen to an increasingly globalized world in a situation where globalization has reached the point where some of the economic interaction between major economies can be defined in areas that those countries from a security perspective find uncomfortable. The second, of course, is globalization. Even as we confront the decoupling issue, the whole question around increasing trade friction, what people have labeled as protectionism, but which is really actually populism in major democracies, the process of globalization has continued apace. Emerging economies continued to grow in ways that really brought them tighter into the embrace of other economies. Increased interdependence continues to happen, and some of those deals and trends that are now appear to be completely on hiatus are happening even now. But along with globalization, there can be deglobalization, and what certainly we will experience over the course of 2020 as the defining characteristic of this year is deglobalization, decreasing amounts of trade, cross-border investment, a distancing of economies, reflecting the fact that human beings, because of the virus, are not associating with one another as much. And so that will be reflected in economic activity across borders, or even within borders for complex places like the United States or China. The question then becomes, and the interesting one for next year, or the latter half of this year, will be what will be the process of reglobalization against the backdrop of decoupling, against the backdrop of the coronavirus. And the instinct, the gut feeling of the people at my firm and myself is that reglobalization process will happen starting in Asia and spreading outward just as the virus did. And the question is then, what is the role of the United States going to be in that? That's an important question for Americans. I realize not everyone on this call is American. So let me walk you through three things then, thinking about the impact of the virus. With that, overly broad perhaps background, but the food for thought that I think we all need to be thinking about. Paths of transmission. Now, when you've all been talking primarily about trade and the traditional paths for transmission of an economic event from one economy to the next through the trade channel is sectoral-based supply chain disruptions or rejoinings, or an overall change in external demand that then reshapes the trade direction. And both are happening now. So initially in the coronavirus case, people were focused primarily on what are the things that we're not going to get from China that are necessary in order to put together the pieces, the supply chain question. And that was a complex, and still is a complex question. There are entire factories in Japan which have been shut down or can't produce their final goods because of inputs that are not reaching them from China because the factories in China are closed. There are similar instances in the United States and other economies, although to a lesser degree than in the economies that are more closely intertwined with China in that supply chain question, primarily the ASEAN countries, Japan, and especially the Republic of Korea. But this has all been very sector specific and even product specific. You can have, even within the automotive sector, for example, you can have one car that can't be made because there's no parts and another car that can be made. And so people switch out the lines or try and adjust to that fact. But it is the fact of the matter, take automobiles, for example. In order to complete a vehicle, you got to have all the parts. You can't ship a vehicle missing headlights, right? No one's going to buy it, or with no steering wheel. And you might have 9,999 of the 10,000 parts in an automobile, but if you don't have that last part, you can't ship it. So the supply chain disruptions have an exponential effect the more complex the product is. And that's something that we were seeing already, which has had a big impact on China's immediate neighbors in terms of, for example, first quarter performance, where Japan, which hoped initially to be in a position of a rebound from the inevitable downturn that they expected after raising the consumption tax on October 1st, that just hasn't happened. And that probably won't happen in the second quarter as well. And Japan may experience 3 or perhaps 4 quarters of year-on-year downward growth in starting from October 1st. So that's channel number one. Channel number two is external demand. And as economies grow more slowly, then they're not going to buy stuff from one another, and the shipment numbers will come down. Now, one question is, how much inventory has there been? Now, the fact that the supply chains have been disruptive, of course, has created a situation where companies and distributors might have insufficient inventory, but then the demand question, as the demand falls off, it works in the opposite direction. But they both end up leading to the same net result, which is less economic activity. The question is the transmission channel. So you can actually have supply chain shocks that are being masked by the fact that there's no demand for the goods, or a demand side phenomenon, a decrease in consumption, which may be attributed to a supply chain disruption, but is in fact the result of just general no one going out and consuming those goods. So that's trade, and that's how it works. And it's quite simple. This isn't the case where the exogenous factor, and I'll do a little bit of comparison to other shocks in a minute. The exogenous factor, unlike 9/11, where it was ships and planes not traveling or finding it more difficult to get around, along with a sense of diminished expectations for consumption and investment. but rather it's that people aren't moving. So it's gonna play itself out in a different way than 9/11 did, but it will have some similar characteristics in terms of the severity and the steepness of the shock. So that's trade. Now, the fact of the matter is, unfortunately, the piece in other sectors of the economy is actually more severe than the trade impact. So although you all are focused on trade today, let me talk about two other things, which is services sector and financial and macroeconomic transmission of negative economic news. The services piece is particularly important. If you go back through the statistics over the last 20 years, there's been a certain growth in trade globally over those years, and everyone tracks that, and it's been robust, right? Trade has grown faster than GDP, and services trade, when that's counted in, now often people focus on trading goods more than trade and services, but services trade has expanded even faster than goods trade. What's happening now is services trade is contracting faster than goods trade, again, because of the social distancing taking place between people. And that's going to be extraordinarily severe. So it's not just tourism and travel, but all other services. People aren't going to go out and get haircuts. People aren't going to, go to the doctor as much or take advantage of other services that are available. There's some things which, of course, will happen. The tax accountants won't experience a problem because everyone's got to meet the deadline and they'll pay their taxes. I just did, and it was very painful. But that situation in services is going to be extraordinarily severe, and we'll see the most bankruptcies and downturns, specific services related sectors. And that's tough because more and more those have become internationally provided goods, and particularly the ownership. Even if the goods the services are provided locally, the ownership can be international in nature, like web-based services, for example, or distribution can be internationally owned. And so that brings us then to the other one, the most dangerous type of cross-border economic bad news transmission, which is in the financial sector. And it's most dangerous because when financial sectors tighten up and contract and channels don't move, then everything else shuts down. And you can get into a situation where lots and lots of people have a hole in their personal finances, or companies have a hole in their corporate finances, and then it takes more time to dig out of those holes because they're not credit worthy. They have trouble getting credit. You get a credit contraction. You all know this. A general macroeconomic contraction fed by a financial constriction is going to be more severe than a demand shock that's exogenous in nature and more lasting just because of the nature of it. So in terms of what's happened on that so far, not as much so far, right? I think most of the epidemiological type people are forecasting that for the United States, the peak could peak in April and be done in May, or it could peak in May and June and not be done until July or August. And those will be very different results in terms of the impact. Both the number of people that are not doing normal economic activity and how long it goes on will impact the degree of financial constriction that takes place. I'm giving you economics 101, but I think it's important to review that financial constriction will be, we don't know yet how bad it's going to be, but the early signs are that the Federal Reserve and others are expecting it to be rather severe. That's why despite the fact that the Fed did, it's not unprecedented, but it's been 12 years since the last time this was deployed, a full 1 percentage point interest rate cut by the Fed on a Sunday, trying to stabilize and send positive market signals because of what they were reading and hearing in the tea leaves of global finance actually ended up resulting in a downturn in markets that the U.S. is experiencing today, and overnight in Asian markets, a general sell-off. Not as severe as the early part of last week, but still an expression that, well, okay, we get it that all the central banks are going to be putting pedal to the metal to try and keep financing as cheap as possible from the government side, and lots of government guarantees being put into place. But we're still not convinced as markets that that's going to be sufficient to get through this shock. That is a real problem. What we expect to see is all of the governments of the world, frankly, but particularly Asia, Europe, and the United States, looking very, very closely and very quickly at some extraordinary fiscal measures, government spending to match the monetary policy outlays of the central banks. Central banks can act quickly, but the results tend to be slow as they work their way through the economy. Governments have trouble acting quickly, particularly democracies, but the results can be felt faster depending upon the design of the fiscal measures. So that, again, all very familiar, but that's going to be the conversation. And all of this is interrelated, the trade piece, the services trade, and the financial and macroeconomic piece going forward. So, again, to review, how does this feel compared to other shocks that have taken place in the past? And we've got some examples to draw from, unfortunately, in the last 30 years between the Asian financial crisis, then we had, after that, I'm doing chronologically, you've got SARS, and then you got 9/11, and then you got the global financial crisis. All had different impacts, and that's the chronology. The spark of the problem in each case was different in terms of location, in terms of its nature and its volume. But to review, they've had differential impacts in terms of how long the problem has lasted and how deep the problem went. The starting with the Asian financial crisis, it started with developing economies being over leveraged, and that spreading to Japan, to Korea, and then to much of the emerging market world. But the China and the United States, biggest economies in Europe, were able to kind of ride it out and compensate for those changes, and it all kind of went by in a year or two. But it was financial in nature. So again, you had a sharp downtrend and a slow trajectory of recovery, particularly in the countries that experienced the direct impact of it. SARS was a blip, right? Very severe impact on China. Most of the infections were in China and a couple other countries. A big and sharp and short-lived impact on travel and tourism, and a V-shaped recovery. Boom, boom, back up business in no time. And that would be the best case scenario for the coronavirus situation. 9/11 had huge impacts on geopolitics and war making and the US policy towards the Middle East and yada, yada, yada. On the economic side, again, it was like SARS, down and back pretty quickly. US a little slower than others because of the impact on consumer sentiment, but it was primarily a services sector impact through an exogenous shock on travel, and tourism had a big impact on a certain set of companies, but nothing systemic in nature or lasting. And then the one that we want to avoid is the 2008 scenario, the global financial crisis, where things really went down. It started in the world's largest economy. It started, and it was financial in nature rather than physical in nature. And that financial nature aspect to it made it, by its own characteristics, harder to get out of. And you had that very flat, gradual recovery in the United States that took the better part of half of a decade to get back to where things would have been. So looking at that range of possibilities for the current downturn, one can hope that it would be SARS, but it's already bigger than SARS, and the Chinese economy was bigger when it started, and even if it had only been just a China thing, it would have been bigger than SARS. But the disease has spread well beyond China, and looks like it'll have similarly large blossomings throughout other countries of the world, happening not simultaneously but in succession, perhaps, and that creates a bigger problem in terms of how it feeds through the world system. So that would be too optimistic. Whether this becomes like the global financial crisis, and the Fed is looking, through its behavior, pushing interest rates to zero in a precipitous manner, would seem to indicate that its calculation is that this could be as big as the global financial crisis in terms of the amount of constricted activity. But will it last as long? And that's really the key question that we don't know at this point, because we don't know how successful the major economies will be in the social distancing aspect in order to try and bring things to a close as quickly as possible. How quick the vaccine comes online, the treatment cases, and is there a second wave? Like, does China have a second wave of coronavirus in the fall, or does its success this winter, spring, mean that it doesn't come back there and they're positioned to keep it out? So, don't know, is the short answer to that, but I think it's useful to benchmark. And the last thing I'll do, and then we should go to questions and conversation, is think about it country by country.
Yeah.
In Asia. And very briefly, just looking at the starting points of the economies and their political capabilities to deliver the kind of policy that's needed. One could looking at some of the major markets. China, its starting point, although slower, was still strong, growing at whatever percent China is actually growing at, somewhere between 4% and 6% on the last few years. One could expect that to bounce back, and one could expect the Chinese government to be fairly quick-footed in its response, both in terms of monetary policy and fiscal policy, to try and bring things back online. So that's probably the brightest spot in Asia, and it's also the largest economy. The one thing that constrains China, of course, is its bad debt overload, and its desire to not let lots of inefficient state-owned enterprises completely off the hook for their lack of profitability. But certainly China will take what measures it needs in the short term in order to try and prevent something more systemic, creating even more bad debt and overload. And China is kind of invested out in terms of hard infrastructure investment. And you've seen that in their policies, and their smart ones, to, in Wuhan in particular, emphasize getting money out to small businesses, the ones that have been most damaged by the downturn due to the coronavirus. Try and keep as many of those businesses alive as possible, which makes good sense, and you would expect that to be a relative bright spot going forward. Japan's the next biggest economy in the region, and it was doing about as badly as Japan ever does, no better, no worse, leading into the situation. It has some depth in terms of its fiscal capability. It doesn't have as much depth in terms of its monetary policy capability. One could expect its decision-making to be fairly good, fairly rapid, although there's going to be instability surrounding the whole question of the Olympics, the whole question of the prime ministerial succession. Regardless of all that, there is a ruling party which is firmly in charge of the country and can be expected to make policy happen. India is a bit of a question mark, frankly. The economy was already in a downturn, and whether it has the wherewithal to keep to have the government really play an active role in getting resources to the private sector or not. I think it bears close watching. Korea is one to pay very particularly close attention to. I would think their economy was in relatively difficult condition. They are disproportionately impacted by the supply chain shocks that I was describing, disproportionately affected by the external demand shocks, and their governance situation is not entirely stable. So one could see some difficulty in enacting the kind of measures. Although the Bank of Korea was very quick and acted yesterday, one could see some real problems there, and it's worth focusing on that as a tough point. And then I'll just mention, because I used to live there until the last summer, Hong Kong is in a passel of trouble. Economically, it's one of the most external shock vulnerable economies in the region, and politically, it's in a state of near paralysis, except for the parts that look after and mind the key questions of the economy around the Hong Kong's participation in the global financial markets, and its ability to back those up with using its fiscal reserves. So I would expect that we'll see in Hong Kong three things. One is the financial markets will continue to reflect global trends, not local trends. The local economy will look extraordinarily bad throughout 2020, and there will be more political instability in the coming year, which is all kind of sad. So I think that's probably enough to get started. Maybe we should go to some questions and comments and criticisms. I'm sure there's some of those too.
Sure. Thanks for that great overview. One of the first questions deals with what you were just talking about. So maybe you can elaborate a little bit more on China and Hong Kong. Will the coronavirus impact the relationship between China and Hong Kong and change the dynamic that led to last year's protests? I mean, does the interjection of the virus into this already tense relationship, I mean, what will it mean? What will that mean about Chinese control over Hong Kong and the limits they're trying to put on it?
That's an interesting question. It's a little bit the answer would be a bit speculative in nature, but the virus has impacted both the Chinese economy and the Hong Kong economy negatively. It has slowed down the process of integration of the Hong Kong and mainland economies. It has created, at the emotional and personal and political level, perhaps even greater distrust between those in Hong Kong who are already distrustful of China and China, and even more distance in public opinion between those who are more accommodative towards the mainland and those who are more distrustful. The Hong Kong government has actually done a very credible job, at least appears from the numbers, and it looks like this is true, in containing the coronavirus infections. It's getting zero credit for that because the trust level towards the government was low to start with. So I think the net result of that is continued bad feeling, a sense of some people, and there will be people in Hong Kong come summertime saying, look, see, China did a good job of containing this virus. Maybe the virus came from China, but they did a good job responding to it. Look, the West is having a problem dealing with it. Maybe we should cut China some slack. And people whose mind are already made up to be anti-China saying, well, no, China has created this virus. The fact that we're part of China is one of the reasons why we got hit by it, and we're continuing to experience no tourism and no visitations from China, and it's their fault. So really, I think the net impact could be greater polarization of public opinion within Hong Kong, even though there will be people hoping that the opposite is true. I don't think it'll necessarily impact the mainland's policy towards Hong Kong, beyond the fact that the one thing that perhaps might happen is mainland government's pretty busy, and it's going to have a lot going on, and I don't think it'll be looking to do anything interesting or precipitous, either positively or negatively, in its policy towards Hong Kong. I'm probably trying to set that aside, relatively speaking, and that puts the city in the driver's seat, and whether it, in my gut instinct that it's going to be another hot summer with a lot of protests, but whether that's where the population goes or not, it's not entirely predictable, and it doesn't necessarily, it's not necessarily driven by calm thought about self-interest, but rather just what feels right to people.
Okay, so dealing with the trust issue also, how trustworthy are the numbers we are getting from China, both on coronavirus and on economic output?
I think the numbers on coronavirus are probably being reported faithfully, depending upon the quality of the information. So the numbers, I think the numbers in China about coronavirus cases are probably better than the numbers in the United States. The reason for that being that they've been at it longer and there's more testing going on, and more control measures in place, and contact tracing and the like. And the numbers in the US are just because there's an insufficient testing taking place. So I don't think that either nation or government or any of the governments of the world really, frankly, have a self-interest in lying about the numbers of coronavirus cases. I would guess that the economic numbers are about as off as they always are. And they're useful as an indicator of direction, but I wouldn't bet too much money based on exact gradations in those numbers. And there are people who start with the assumption 6% growth number means 6%. People that say, well, that means, whatever it really is, and then look at the direction of it. I kind of fall in that camp. China has a good incentive to accurately report the direction of the economy, but maybe not the exact figures.
Okay. So we got a question from International Trade Today. Are the top manufacturers of ventilators in China? Is there a capacity for ramp up of that? And will the trade war with China mean any additional machines will go to Europe, not the US?
I don't know sorry, I'm not an expert on the ventilator manufacturing market and where they take place. My guess is that there would not be any, I would be very surprised if China intentionally put a ban on any particular foreign market for ventilators. That would be an extraordinarily incendiary thing to do.
Okay. So, okay, here we got a question. The first shipment of masks and coronavirus test kits to the US is taking off from Shanghai. Should President Trump start showing China some love? I'm not exactly sure where we should go with that, but if we are getting these critical supplies from China, should that indicate a thawing?
Whoever uses the masks should probably say, that's great and thank you. And at the same time, the US is shipping food to China. So, trade is good, right? Everyone should say thank you every day, just as out of namaste kind of philosophy of life. The president is always all over the map on China, in terms of going back and forth between trying to maintain a good footing and being critical. So I expect him to continue to bounce around on that.
Okay. So can you talk about the impact on demand for food and meats and grains to feed livestock, corn and soybeans?
Demand where?
I guess we're talking about demand in, I'm presuming demand in China from US farm producers. Do we know if there's going to be an impact on that?
Well, the agricultural trade tends to be fairly steady, right? Now, China lost a large number of pigs to the African swine flu, and so that would have suppressed demand somewhat for corn and other inputs into the pork industry. But aside from that, there's a certain math to the whole livestock industry, and livestock need to eat a certain amount in order to make the meat that people eat. So what the main thing that happened because of the U.S.-China trade friction was a disruption in where China was getting its agricultural inputs, and those had an impact on prices and also on routes. So the much of that's now been reestablished because of the agreement that was reached between the U.S. and China in January, and so I would expect that there, those shipments will happen. There's also no good reason for agricultural goods not to be shipped because of the virus. That's not a transmission route for the virus. So a ship carrying a bunch of grain is perfectly safe.
Okay. Related food question. Could Chinese authorities ramp up imports of meat and other food products in order to lower prices of food for its own consumers as a gesture of goodwill?
Sure. Why not?
Okay. All right.
If it chose to do so, or if it just wanted to make people happy. Chinese people kind of missed Chinese New Year's this year, which is a big festival of consumption. So they maybe there'll be, who knows, if China wanted to, they could declare that like some week in July is a big holiday and everyone should eat a lot, and that would be demand.
Okay. So, I mean, on the coronavirus numbers from China, the charts that I've seen of showing just a leveling off of them, and I've seen headlines about that they reached their peak a while ago. What do you make of those numbers, and do you think it's a true peak, or will it possibly jump up again later on?
Well, the latter part of that's harder. I think the numbers, there isn't really any good reason to doubt that they're accurate as far as the information that is being gathered. And China, having started earlier and doing this intensively for a long time, is tracking things extraordinarily closely and is doing lots and lots of testing. So the shape of the Chinese epidemic was the kind of shape that epidemiologists are familiar with, or at least they say that, right? That it went up and then it starts to level off, and then the number of new cases starts to decline, and the recovered people catch up, and then the number of existing cases go down. Meanwhile, there's been a whole ramp up in the provision of medical care, so that there's you end up in a situation where you have plenty of capacity to deal with the infections, and then things go down further. The question about a second rebound is a very good one, and so there's going to be a strong incentive for China to continue to be very, very excuse me, let me just say no to this. To be tough on inward travel, on travel within China, and track closely what's going on at the same time as trying to ramp up the economy. So, there is a possibility of resurgence in China, certainly, and I'm not capable of predicting whether that's going to happen or not.
Okay. So you talked. We have a question related to decoupling. Related to your globalization, deglobalization reflection, do you see coronavirus accelerating U.S.-China decoupling?
Yes, it already did accelerate that, and both in terms of lack of travel, lack of contact, meaning deals that were foregone, and also a little bit of sense of what some of the other questions were kind of driving at, perhaps obliquely, is the whole question about trust at the government level. which is at a very low ebb, and does also impact then the policy measures which are being taken place in the sense of competitiveness. So the fact that the virus started in China certainly led to even more fuel for the whole decoupling phenomenon. Not as much as some other things, but and it's certainly not the only source of distrust. But listening to the rhetoric in the United States and then the counter rhetoric, or I don't know which one's counter to which, but you know, there's ludicrous storytelling within China that the virus actually started in the United States and that kind of thing, is a sign of the underlying phenomenons being even strengthened by the virus, the decoupling, the factors driving decoupling.
Okay. So let me ask you a question. So most of our
let me score an optimistic
Sure.
note. Don't lose that question. You know, there is potential for the United States and China to, after this is all over, to say, hey, wait a minute. We have just rediscovered the fact that everyone on the planet can infect everybody else, regardless of nationality, borders, and prejudices and our sense of competition and distance from one another. Let's do something about this. Let's have a G20 for medicine, for pandemics, or let's all work together to strengthen the WHO and improve response, or let's create a, you know, in past shocks, you've had strategic petroleum reserves set up all over the world to deal with the fact that back in the 70s, one of the biggest external shocks was the Middle East deciding that they didn't want to give the rest of the world oil. Maybe we need a strategic ventilator reserve. And that's the kind of thing that societies could, in fact, get their act together and talk about and work about. There's not much of that going on right now, and it may be a little bit late on the prevention side of this crisis, but one could think that would be possible. And there is, in fact, very little aside from human nature, there is not much or any reason for people to compete in the sphere of epidemic prevention and preparedness, right? It's by nature a cooperation issue. The theorists around US-China relations are constantly grasping at climate change as the example of why the US and China must get along, because we need to cooperate in response to climate change. I've always been a bit skeptical of that, because the fact of the matter is all of the actions on climate change are by nature local and have an economic cost. So there's a tragedy of the commons which takes place as each society says, well, it's your fault that you're producing too much carbon. And so they're actually, you know, it's not really a cooperative conversation on climate change. But on this, where people are infecting one another, it is by nature that way, and one could hope that you'd see some of that. Sorry to go on that, but it's one of my hobby horses. You had a good question.
Yeah, so a question from one of the viewers. Please comment on the extent to which this pandemic will accelerate reshoring and how fast.
Some, but not, and perhaps in specific sectors, like getting back to the international or the ventilator reserve, strategic ventilator reserve. Perhaps societies will say, well, there's some stuff here that we need to make locally, because we can't be sure about getting it in international commerce, and also investment decisions made locally because people haven't traveled. But I think the incentive for companies, as long as they're not being disincentivized by things like tariffs and investment restrictions, the incentive for companies to continue to invest and trade across borders is going to be very, very, very strong. And a global epidemic per se doesn't change the long-term calculus of that.
Okay, so just a few more questions. We just have a few more minutes here. Justin Trudeau says he's closing the Canadian border to non-U.S. citizens. What effect will this have on the U.S. and for how long?
I guess non-U.S. citizens won't be able to go to Canada. Not a very big impact, I don't think, because most of the people traveling back and forth between the U.S. and Canada are Americans and Canadians.
Okay. So last question, I think. You know Asia well, you know the U.S. well, and you know the economy well, and trade patterns and so forth. I was hoping you could talk a little bit about media coverage of this pandemic and the pandemic itself and the economic fallout from it. Most of our viewers are in the journalism business and the news business. So do you have a perspective on how well you think the pandemic and the related economic issues are being covered in general, and how well they're being covered in the US versus being covered in Asia, China specifically, or other locales?
Sure. I think generally speaking, the global journalism community has been pretty quick to realize the importance of this issue, and has been driving the conversation about the importance of it, as well as reacting to it. And I sense in much media reporting, through reputable outlets, a sense of responsibility about checking facts and not being too much gotcha headline-ish. There is a tendency to want to be, you get stuff like Tom Hanks has coronavirus. Okay, so we all like Tom Hanks, good actor, so people want to know that. And so, it's going to get reported, even though it's not a material fact. In Tom Hanks's infection of coronavirus is as important as, anonymous Jane John Doe person in Australia's infection, right? There's been some sensationalism and exciting stuff. The online stuff is pretty awful. A lot of it is crazy, and people manufacture fake news for some reason. It's kind of an evil thing to do, and that happens in every place. I think one of the challenges, the China story was not well reported because of the restrictions on reporting in China and the language barrier, leading to not a clear sense of what was actually going on there. And so I think the distrust of China and the fact that it has all the restrictions that it has on foreign journalism led to misunderstandings and even more suspicion about what was taking place in China. So I found myself, like yesterday, I watched this half-hour video by GCTN, state-owned, right? Lots of happy music about success in Wuhan, but actually kind of useful to watch because it showed some of the methodologies that were being used, and accurately reported some of the dire circumstances that people have been living with in Wuhan. And I found it useful to watch because it helps get one mentally prepared for what could happen in the United States, which won't be the same as China because it's a different society, but it helps give a sense of scale, and also the fact that people did continue to eat and live, and even though it was terribly inconvenient and miserable. So that kind of my point being that there's been pretty good, but I think that journalists should continue to focus on providing insights as well as facts, and really helping people understand how to deal with the situation, as well as get their eyeballs on shiny objects. And I'd give the overall U.S. journalist community a solid B-.
B-?
Yeah.
Okay.
On
Better than
average.
D-.
Yeah.
All right.
I don't think it's been disastrous, but it has been an exercise for persons like myself to sift through some of the blasty headlines to actually find pieces which were useful and insightful and informative.